Intended to be smelted back into raw metal once the war was over, the actual post-war reality looked very different, with Eastern Europe in particular being dependent on the war locomotives for many more years. The West, however, discarded them fairly quickly. Or did they? While already the Class 50 was developed with military purposes in mind, it should also serve civilian needs, and was therefore a full-featured locomotive, hardly distinguishable from peacetime developments. Only when it became obvious that ultimately Germany's blitzkrieg strategy had failed, a much simpler locomotive, fast and cheap to produce, was required to feed the war machinery. To answer this need, in 1942 a simplified version, or how it was called in Germany Entfeinert, of the Class 50, the Class 52, was introduced as Kriegsdampflokomotive 1, Wartime Steam Locomotive 1, short KDL1, the first design of Germany's war locomotive scheme. With more than 7,000 examples, it is Germany's most numerous, most widespread, and best known locomotive class ever built. A questionable reputation considering its origin. But it would be impossible to tell the entirety of their story in one video. Therefore, I plan to do multiple about the Class 52, focusing on different aspects. And to start off, we start at the end. At least the end of the West German machines. As the Class 52 was mainly employed at the Eastern Front line, it is also there where most of them were found after the war, with the Soviet Union, East Germany and Poland all inheriting 4-digit numbers of them. West Germany had only comparatively few, albeit with 800 examples, making it to the Deutsche Bundesbahn, the Federal Railway of West Germany, still a large fleet. Despite the large initial number, however, the Class 52 was not supposed to play a major role in West Germany, as towards the end of the war, most of the modern peacetime locomotives were transported out of the territory soon to be occupied by the Soviet forces. Therefore the western zones had, once sorted and at least somewhat mended and repaired, a reasonable assortment of modern locomotives, and could therefore withdraw the wartime locomotives fairly quickly, which didn't only lack many features, but were also often of poor build quality and generally disliked by crews. Only about 250 of them were ever employed by the Bundesbahn. The merely 154 examples that were still in work and order, and 100 additional ones that were overhauled and repaired, with the rest being stored cold before final withdrawal. During the war, all German wartime locomotives were painted in grey, the initial ones in the light iron grey, later in the darker black grey. As good paints were a rare commodity after the war, one can only assume the remaining 52s kept their grey paint for quite some time. Already around 1950, however, the first photographies appear that clearly showcase a deep black and fire red paint scheme, with black and white photography naturally only identifiable on the basis of two different shades between the area below and above the running board. It still seems likely though that even some of the examples still in use never received a peacetime paint scheme, as withdrawal of even the serviceable 52s began no later than in 1954, with the final ones being withdrawn in 1962, and even those reused as stationary heating plants only lasted a few years longer. But that is not where the story ends. While it might seem West Germany was fairly well off in terms of inherited locomotives, reality was a bit more complicated. As the standardization scheme of the pre-war Reichsbahn was never fully realized, there were still many, by no more than outdated state railway designs. And on the opposite end of the range, many of the youngest full-featured locomotives, including the Class 50, suffered from boilers made from poor steel, with boiler cracks being an all too common issue. A large program of new-built boilers and locomotives would have been needed, but the required resources for something like that were simply not yet available, so more unconventional solutions were required. While the wartime locomotives of the Class 52 were nothing the Deutsche Bundesbahn wanted, they were still very young machines with many modern traits, and due to their descent from the Class 50, many parts are interchangeable. As such, with a Withdrawal, most of them did not went straight to the scrapyard, but served as parts donors first. One particularly low-hanging fruit were the self-carrying tub tenders, the so-called one-in-tender. They fit 30 cubic meters of water and 10 tons of coal. In other words, 40 tons of load while having an empty weight of just 18.5 tons. This is possible due to the all-welded half-cylinder water tank, the name-bearing tub, which through its welded construction is strong enough to take all of the push and pull forces usually taken by the frame, making the later one obsolete. Furthermore, it has excellent running abilities, including when being used as the leading vehicle. So why scrap these sparse but efficient tenders when so many inferior ones of state railway origin were still in use? Therefore, it only makes sense the most numerous of the remaining state railway locomotives, the Prussian P8, was chosen to receive them. This way, about 700 of the more than 1200 available P8s exchanged their Prussian tender with a modern one-in-tender, altered to be able to be coupled with the P8. This increased the range significantly due to the larger water tank. Until then, the majority of P8s could only carry 21.5 cubic meters of water, compared to the 30 of the new tenders. Furthermore, the new tenders improved their riding abilities, and as such enabled them to run backwards at high speeds too. Their open cabs made that quite uncomfortable though. To solve this last obstacle, more than 40 P8s received also modified enclosed cabs, and in turn could now be coupled with unmodified tub tenders. Furthermore, these were also fitted with push and pull equipment to increase the versatility even further. But I already made a separate video about the push and pull P8s, should you be interested. A comparatively small number of one-in-tender, after all, with the 700 used for P8s, there were not too many left, was used for Class 50 locomotives. Like the P8, the Class 50 has an open cab though. Therefore either the cab or the tender had to be modified, and both variants existed. But way more significant for the Class 50 were the boilers taken from the 52s. Many of the Class 50's boilers were made from the infamous steel type ST47K. Due to its high strength, it allowed for thinner outer walls and therefore a lighter boiler compared to one made from conventional steel. What was not known at the time, however, is how this material would age. But it soon became apparent that it did age very poorly. It quickly became brittle and often started to form cracks within the first years of service. While initially barely visible, these cracks could lead to fatal consequences, and often did, with boiler explosions being frighteningly common in the 1940s. While reducing the allowed boiler pressure helped keeping the cracks at bay, this was not a viable long-term solution, especially as the condition of these boilers was continuously deteriorating and repairs being difficult due to the ST47K steel being tough to weld. While, learning from the mistake, the boilers of the Class 52 were made from conventional steel again, replacement boilers for the 50s were only supplied in very severe cases of boiler decay, as the construction of new locomotives had priority during the war. But when the war was over, and West Germany did their stock taking, new built replacement boilers were even less of an available option. Nevertheless, by that point, something had to be done. It was estimated that around 800 new boilers for the Class 50 would be needed. While maybe sparse and of sometimes questionable build quality, the boilers of the Class 52 were made from the proven steel ST34 and were still fairly youthful, and as such perfect to fix up the Class 50s. This way, far more than 500 locomotives were fitted with replacement boilers until the early 1960s, with even some of the final withdrawn 52s still serving as donors. The exact number, however, is unfortunately lost to history due to poor and missing documentation. But spotting an exchanged boiler isn't as easy as you might think. On my model you might notice the missing steam feeder dome, as well as a large, simplistic square sandbox, replacing the two smaller rounded ones, both typical for the Class 52. However, many 50s built during the war had these features too. Plus, sandboxes are easily interchangeable, so Class 50 locomotives fitted with boilers from a 52 often kept the proper sandboxes, and sometimes even the missing dome was retrofitted to the replacement boilers. But if you had a Class 50 with only a single dome, square sandbox, and maybe even a tub tender and enclosed cab, I couldn't blame you for thinking it was a Class 52. Especially considering the other modifications the Bundesbahn undertook on their 50s, like removing the skirting from the front and replacing the large Wagner-type smoke deflectors with the small Witte-type ones, similar to those used during the war. But looking at the cylinders and valve gear, the only definite traits separating a 50 from a 52, leaves no doubt this is a Class 50. But this isn't. Both the replacement boilers from the Class 52 as well as their tub tenders stayed in service until the 1970s, the final years of steam in West Germany. A surprisingly long time, considering West Germany withdrew the last Class 52 in 1962. Wartime Germany intended them to be thrown away. But post-war Germany learned how to recycle, or rather how to salvage and reuse, with other options simply not being available. As such, the Class 52, or at least parts of it, shaped the locomotive fleet of West Germany for way longer than the Deutsche Bundesbahn would have liked to admit. But this is only the simplest part of the convoluted history of Germany's Kriegslokomotiven. So why not subscribe to get informed about future videos about this and also other locomotive classes. Let me know what you would like to hear about in a future video. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this first look into the history of Germany's most numerous locomotive. And equally numerous thank yous go to my channel members Dave Heise, Flip Schwip, Kay Frankly and Lucas Ilskens for supporting my work in a direct way. See you in the next video here at Steel Bridge Models.